Oh, hello there, dear. Come on in. Have a seat with me. There's always another cup in the pot. It's a lovely afternoon, isn't it? The sun is just catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Reminds me of little fairies. I was just sitting here, stirring my tea. Just a splash of milk, the way I like it tend. My mind started to wander, as it so often does these days. It's the little things that send you back. The clink of the spoon against the porcelain. It's funny what a sound can do. I was just tidying up the old mahogany box on the mantelpiece, the one my Arthur made for me all those years ago. It's filled with bits and bobs, little treasures that don't mean much to anyone else, but to me. Oh, to me they are everything. And my fingers, they brushed against this. She reaches into the pocket of her cardigan and pulls out a small, tarnished, heart-shaped locket, its front embedded with a single, small, deep green emerald. She holds it in her palm, her thumb gently stroking its surface. This old thing, it doesn't look like much now, I suppose. The silver is worn, the hinge is a bit loose. But this locket holds the weight of a promise I nearly broke, and the story of a silence that lasted 20 years. You see, this was my mother's, and the day she gave it to me, I didn't understand its true worth. I thought it was just a piece of jewelry. It wasn't until I was faced with a choice, a terrible, lonely choice, at a windswept train station in the autumn of 1958, that I began to understand. A choice that would either build my future or leave me forever haunted by the past. It all started with the rain. Back in my childhood home in the countryside, the rain had a different sound. It wasn't the angry, hurried patter you get in the city. It was a slow, steady drumming on the tin roof of our little cottage, a rhythm you could set your life to. Our cottage was small, but it was filled with the smell of my mother's baking cinnamon and apple mousse and the scent of damp earth and lavender from the garden. We didn't have much, not in the way of money. My father, he was a good man, a strong man who worked the land until his hands were as tough as old leather. But the farm never gave us more than we needed. My mother, Elara, she was the heart of our home. She had a quiet strength, a resilience that I didn't fully appreciate when I was a girl. I was her only child, her little shadow. I remember her hands, always busy, kneading dough, mending clothes, tending to her precious rose bushes. And she always wore this locket. It lay nestled just at the hollow of her throat, a single spark of green against her skin. I used to ask her about it. "Mama," I'd say, tracing its shape with my finger, "why is it so special?" She would just smile, a sad, gentle sort of smile, and say, "It holds a memory, little one, a promise of courage." I never understood. To me, courage was my father facing down a stray bull, or climbing the big oak tree by the river. What courage could be held in such a small, silent object? The day she gave it to me was my 16th birthday. The world felt so big then, and I felt so small within it. It was a gray, overcast day, the kind that makes you want to curl up with a book. But there was a restlessness in me, a yearning for something more than the rhythmic drumming on the tin roof, more than the scent of lavender. I wanted to see the city, the bright lights I'd only read about in magazines. My mother found me by the window, staring out at the rolling hills that suddenly felt like a cage. She didn't say anything at first. She just came and stood beside me, her warmth a familiar comfort. Then she unclasped the locket from her own neck. The silver felt cool against my skin as she fastened it around mine. "This is for you now, Evelyn," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was my mother's, and her mother's before that. "It's not just a piece of jewelry, it's a reminder. A reminder that you have a strength inside you that you haven't even begun to understand. There will be times, my love, when you feel utterly alone, when the world feels cold and sharp. In those moments, I want you to hold on to this, and remember that you are a part of a long line of women who have faced their fears and walked through them. Promise me you'll never take it off out of fear." I promised, of course. How could I not? But it was a child's promise, made without understanding the weight of the words. I was more thrilled with the idea of owning something so grown up, something that had been hers. I didn't see the flicker of worry in her eyes, the deep, unspoken story she was passing down along with the heirloom. I wore it proudly, a symbol of my impending womanhood, completely unaware that it was not a celebration, but a shield for a battle I hadn't yet been told I would have to fight. The real story, the one she never told me, began 2 years later. It started with a letter. A letter with a city postmark that arrived on a crisp October morning. The air was filled with the smell of wood smoke and decaying leaves. The beautiful death of autumn. I was helping Father mend a fence when the postman's little van rattled up the lane. I remember the color of the envelope. It was a pale, creamy yellow. It was addressed to my mother. She took it with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, a detail I only remembered much later. She read it in the kitchen, her back to me. The silence in that room was different from the usual comfortable quiet. It was a taut, stretched silence, thin as glass. When she finally turned around, her face was pale, all the color drained from it, and her eyes, oh dear, her eyes looked like she was seeing a ghost I didn't know existed. She folded the letter, tucked it into her apron pocket, and said, "Evelyn, put the kettle on. There's something your father and I need to discuss." That was it. No explanation. Just that cold, heavy feeling that something in our simple, predictable world had just fractured. I didn't know then that the creamy yellow envelope held the past she had tried so hard to outrun, and that its arrival would set in motion a series of events that would lead me to that lonely train station, with my mother's locket feeling like a stone of ice against my skin, forcing upon me the very test she had warned me about, the test of true courage. After that day, the silence in our little cottage changed. It was no longer a comfortable blanket, but a heavy shroud. My parents started having hushed conversations after I'd gone to bed. I'd lie there, straining to hear, but all I could catch were fragments, whispers that slithered under my door, words like obligation, shame, and a name I'd never heard before, Eleanor. The name was always spoken in a low, pained tone by my mother, and with a sort of weary anger by my father. The air in the house grew thick with things unsaid. My mother, who was always humming, fell quiet. She'd stop in the middle of a task, her hand stilled, her gaze lost somewhere far beyond the kitchen walls. She'd clutch the space on her neck where the locket used to be, a phantom gesture of a comfort she had given away. The farm work, which had always been a source of shared purpose, now felt like a chore that kept us apart, lost in our own thoughts. My father grew more withdrawn, his brow perpetually furrowed. The easy laughter that used to echo around our dinner table vanished, replaced by the clinking of forks and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that seemed to be counting down to something I couldn't name. I tried to ask, of course, "Mama, what's wrong? Is someone ill?" She would just pat my hand and force a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's grown-up worries, love. Nothing for you to fret about." But I was fretting. This secret, whatever it was like a poison seeping into the foundations of our home, of our family. It was changing them. It was changing me. One evening I couldn't bear it any longer. I feigned sleep, waiting until I heard their voices begin in the sitting room. I crept out of bed, my feet silent on the cold wooden floorboards, and pressed my ear to the door. This time their voices were clearer, laced with an anguish that made my heart ache. "We can't ignore it, John," my mother pleaded, her voice cracking. "She is my sister. My twin sister." My world tilted on its axis. A sister, a twin. My mother had never, not once, mentioned a sister. All these years, I thought she was an only child, just like me. It felt like a betrayal, a whole part of her life, completely erased. "She is no sister of yours, Ilara." My father's voice was rough with emotion. "Not after what she did. She chose her path. She left you to carry the shame, to build a new life from the ashes of her recklessness. The shame was not mine to carry," my mother retorted, her voice rising with a passion I'd never heard from her before. "And now, she is ill. The letter says she is dying. She's asking for me, forgiveness, forgiveness." My father scoffed. "After 20 years of silence, after she ran off with that gambler, leaving you to face everything alone. She made her bed, Lara, and now she lies dying in it, alone in a city boarding house." She cried. "She has a daughter, John, a little girl. What will happen to her?" A daughter. My mother's sister had a child, a cousin I never knew existed. The pieces were slotting together in my mind, forming a picture of pain and secrecy. This Eleanor was my aunt. She had done something terrible, something that had severed her from our family so completely that her name was never to be spoken, and now she was dying. I crept back to my bed, my mind reeling. The locket around my neck suddenly felt heavy, its meaning shifting once again. It wasn't just about general courage anymore. It was tied to this story, to this lost sister. Was the courage my mother spoke of, the courage it took for her to leave her past, and her sister, behind? Or was it the courage to face it again? The following days were filled with a tense, unspoken debate. I could feel the push and pull between my parents, my mother's desperate need to go, and my father's stubborn refusal to revisit a past that had clearly wounded him deeply. He wasn't a cruel man, my father. I understood, even then, that he was trying to protect my mother, to protect the peaceful life they had built. He saw Eleanor as a threat, a ghost who could undo all their years of careful, quiet living. Finally, a decision was made. I came down for breakfast one morning to find my mother sitting at the table, a small, worn suitcase at her feet. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her chin was set with a resolve that silenced any argument. My father stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I am going, John," she said softly. "I have to. I cannot let her die alone." He didn't turn around, but he nodded, a sharp, defeated jerk of his head. "How long will you be?" he asked, his voice gruff. "I don't know," she admitted. "A few days, a week at most." She turned to me, and her eyes were filled with a world of love and sorrow. "You'll be a good girl for your father, won't you, Evelyn? Look after him." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. She hugged me tightly, her familiar scent of lavender and cinnamon, a painful reminder of the life that was about to be disrupted. As she pulled away, her eyes fell to the locket on my chest. She reached out and her fingers closed around it. "Remember what I told you," she whispered, her voice fierce. "Remember your strength." And then she was gone. The postman's van, arranged to take her to the train station, rattled away down the lane, leaving behind a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. I didn't know it then, but it was the last time I would ever see her. The days after my mother left were hollow. The cottage felt cavernous without her presence, the air thin and stale. My father and I moved around each other like ghosts, the unspoken tension, a third person in the room. We did the chores, we ate our meals, but the life had gone out of our routines. Every evening, I would sit by the window, watching the lane, expecting to see her coming home, her suitcase in hand, her familiar smile, ready to stitch our fractured family back together. But each evening, the lane remained empty as dusk settled over the hills. A week passed, then 10 days. My father's stoicism began to crack. I'd find him staring at my mother's empty chair, his expression lost and pained. We didn't talk about it. We didn't know how. The silence that had been born of a secret was now being fed by fear. The only connection I had to her was the locket. I would hold it in my hand for hours, the cool metal warming against my skin. I tried opening it, for the first time really, examining the tiny, intricate clasp. But it was stiff, and I was afraid of breaking it. So I just held it, trying to draw from it the strength she had spoken of, trying to feel her close to me. It was a tangible piece of her, a constant presence in her growing absence. Then, nearly 2 weeks after she had left, the telegram arrived. Mr. Henderson from the post office, a man who usually had a cheerful word for everyone, drove up to the cottage himself. He handed the flimsy envelope to my father with a solemn look on his face. "I'm sorry, John," he said quietly. My father's leathery hands trembled as he tore it open. I stood in the doorway, my heart pounding against my ribs. Like a trapped bird, I watched the color drain from his face, leaving it a mask of gray disbelief. He didn't make a sound. He just sank into a chair, the telegram fluttering from his fingers to the floor. I picked it up. The words were stark, brutal in their efficiency. "Regret to inform you, Elara Price, deceased. Influenza. Stop, please. Advise regarding arrangements. Stop." The world stopped, the ticking of the clock, the chirping of a bird outside the window, my own breath, it all ceased. Deceased. It was such a cold, clinical word, it didn't feel real. My mother, my vibrant, warm, humming mother, couldn't be gone. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. But the look on my father's face, a look of utter and complete devastation, told me it was true. He was a strong man, my father. I had never seen him cry, but in that moment, he put his head in his hands and a sound tore from his throat, a raw, ragged sob that shattered the stillness and broke my heart into a million pieces. In that moment, everything changed. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the grief, something else began to curdle. resentment towards the faceless, nameless sister, Eleanor, who had summoned my mother to her deathbed, only to send her to her own. In my father's eyes, and soon in mine, Eleanor was a murderer. She had taken my mother from us. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and quiet condolences from neighbors. My father seemed to age a decade in a matter of days. The light in his eyes went out, replaced by a permanent, haunted sadness. The days that followed were the loneliest of my life. The cottage, once a home, was now just a house, a shell filled with memories that were too painful to touch. My father threw himself into his work, from sunup to sundown, as if he could outrun his grief. But at night, I would hear him, walking the floors, the house groaning under the weight of his sorrow, and my resentment towards Eleanor grew, watered by my father's silent, unending pain. She was the villain in our story, the ghost who had not only haunted our past but had now destroyed our future. But a month later, another letter arrived. It was from a solicitor in the city. It stated that my aunt, Eleanor, had also passed away, just days after my mother, and that she had named my mother, Laura, as the legal guardian for her 5-year-old daughter, a girl named Lily. In the event of my mother's death, the guardianship was to pass to her next of kin. To me, I was 18 years old, and I was now the legal guardian of the daughter of the woman I blamed for my mother's death. The letter stated that if we did not claim the child, she would be made a ward of the state. My father's reaction was immediate and absolute. "No," he said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "We will not. She is not our blood, not in any way that matters. We will not take in the child of that woman. Let the state have her." His grief had hardened into something brittle and unforgiving. He could not see a child. He could only see the daughter of the woman who had taken his wife. And I, lost in my own sea of sorrow and anger, I agreed with him. It felt like a betrayal of my mother's memory to welcome this child, this living reminder of our tragedy, into our home. And so, we wrote back, a short, cold letter, relinquishing all responsibility. We were washing our hands of Eleanor and her legacy, once and for all. Or so I thought. By the way, dear, wherever you're watching from, whatever time it is there, I hope you have someone you love close by. I'd love to hear from you in the comments below, just to know we're sharing this moment together. That decision, to turn our backs on a little girl, settled in the house like another layer of dust. For a while, it felt like the right thing to do, a necessary act of self-preservation. But, as the seasons changed, and winter settled its cold grip on the land, something began to gnaw at me. It started as a whisper, a flicker of unease. I would look at my mother's empty chair, and I would think of a 5-year-old girl, alone in the world, who had just lost her own mother. I tried to push the thoughts away, tried to cling to my anger, but the image of that child, a child who was my cousin, began to haunt my quiet moments. The locket around my neck felt heavier than ever, a constant, silent accusation. I was failing the test my mother had set for me, the test of courage, for I was choosing fear. Fear of the past, fear of the pain, fear of the future, and I was about to discover that some ghosts cannot be outrun, no matter how hard you try. Life settled into a new, bleak rhythm. My father and I were two islands of grief in the same quiet house. We worked, we ate, we slept. We did not talk about my mother. We did not talk about Eleanor. We did not talk about the child. It was a conspiracy of silence, an unspoken pact to bury the past so that we might survive the present. The locket remained around my neck, but I stopped touching it. Its presence was a reproach. It represented a promise I was actively breaking every day, the promise of courage. My mother had asked me to be strong in the face of fear, and instead, I had huddled behind my father's anger and my own, letting a child, my own flesh and blood, drift away into the cold, impersonal arms of the state. The winter was long and harsh. The snow fell in thick blankets, isolating our cottage even more, mirroring the isolation in my own heart. I kept busy, cleaning the house with a frantic energy, scrubbing away at phantom stains as if I could scrub away the guilt that was beginning to fester inside me. One afternoon, driven by a need to feel close to my mother, I decided to go through her old belongings, which had been packed away in a trunk in the attic. My father never went up there. It was too painful, but I needed a piece of her, a connection to the woman she was before the whispers and the secrets began. The attic was cold and smelled of old wood and dried herbs. Sunlight streamed weakly through a single dusty window. I found the trunk in a corner, covered by a white sheet like a small ghost. I lifted the heavy lid, and the scent of my mother lavender and mothballs rose up to meet me. Inside were her Sunday dresses, a pair of worn dancing shoes, and a box of letters from my father when they were courting, and beneath it all, I found a small, leather-bound photo album. I had never seen it before. I sat down on the dusty floorboards and opened it. The first few pages were familiar, pictures of my grandparents, my father as a young man, my mother as a bride. But then, as I turned a page, I saw a photograph that made me catch my breath. It was a picture of two young girls, maybe 10 or 11 years old, with identical cheeky grins and matching pinafore dresses. They had their arms slung around each other's shoulders, two peas in a pod. One was my mother, the other had to be Eleanor. I had expected to feel a surge of my old anger, to see the face of the villain who had destroyed our lives, but I didn't. I saw a child, a happy child, who looked so much like my mother that it was impossible to tell them apart, save for a tiny mole just above Eleanor's eyebrow. I kept turning the pages. There were more photos of them together, growing up, laughing, playing, sharing secrets. They were inseparable. The love between them was so palpable it seemed to radiate from the faded black and white images. How could this love have curdled into 20 years of silence and a betrayal so deep it tore a family apart? What could have happened? Then, near the back of the album, I found a loose photograph tucked between the pages. It was more recent, perhaps. It was of Eleanor, a young woman now, standing next to a handsome but roguish-looking man. He had a charming smile, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. Eleanor was looking at him with an expression of pure adoration. On the back, in my mother's familiar handwriting, was a single, stark sentence. The day she chose him over everything. And then, behind that picture, was another, tucked away as if in shame. It was a formal letter, folded into a small square. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. It wasn't a letter, not really. It was a copy of a birth certificate. Lily Rose Price, born June 4, 1953. Mother, Eleanor Price. And the space for the father's name was empty, blank. He had left her. The charming, roguish man had left her to raise a child on her own. My mother had known. She had kept this, hidden it away. She hadn't just erased her sister. She had preserved the evidence of her struggle. Sitting there in the cold, dusty attic, the truth began to dawn on me, a slow, painful sunrise. Eleanor wasn't a one-dimensional villain. She was a woman who had made a mistake, a woman who had loved the wrong person, a woman who had been abandoned. And my mother. My mother hadn't gone to the city out of a cold sense of obligation. She had gone because of love. The enduring, complicated love for the twin sister she had shared a life with. She had gone to offer the forgiveness that my father, in his hurt and pride, could not. She had gone to help her sister, and, I suspected, to meet the niece she had never known. And she had died doing it. The locket on my chest suddenly burned with an intense heat. The courage she had spoken of. It wasn't the courage to run from the past. It was the courage to face it, to mend what was broken, to choose love even when it was hard. And what had I done? I had chosen the easy path. The path of anger and blame. I had let my father's bitterness become my own. I had abandoned a child, my cousin, just as that man had abandoned Eleanor. The shame washed over me in a tidal wave, so potent it almost buckled me over. I had failed my mother in the most profound way possible. I had dishonored her memory, her final act of love. I sat there for a long time, the photograph of the two smiling girls in my hand, the birth certificate in my lap, the silence of the house pressed in on me. But now, it wasn't an empty silence. It was filled with the ghost of a little girl, a girl with my mother's eyes and my aunt's name, a girl who was alone in a city that had swallowed both our mothers. I looked at the picture of the two sisters, inseparable and joyful. I finally understood. Family wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even after 20 years of silence. It was about forgiveness. It was about protecting the innocent. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, what I had to do. The decision was terrifying. It meant defying my father, leaving the only home I had ever known, and venturing into a world I knew nothing about. But for the first time since my mother's death, I felt a flicker of her strength inside me. I closed the photo album, tucked the birth certificate and the picture of the two sisters into my pocket, and walked down from the attic. The time for hiding was over. I had to go and find Lily. Making the decision was one thing. Acting on it was another entirely. I knew my father would never agree. His heart had been walled off, and the name Eleanor was the key to a door he had bolted shut forever. To him, bringing her child into our home would be like inviting the fox into the hen house. It would be a desecration of my mother's memory, not a fulfillment of her final wish. I knew I couldn't reason with him. His grief was too raw, too absolute. If I was going to do this, I would have to do it alone, and I would have to do it in secret. The next few days were a blur of clandestine planning. I felt like a spy in my own home. I wrote a letter to the solicitor in the city, using the address from his previous correspondence. I was careful, my handwriting deliberately neat, my words chosen with precision. I stated my intention to assume guardianship of my cousin Lily, as was my right as next of kin. I explained that there had been a misunderstanding due to our recent bereavement. I asked for the address of the orphanage or care home where she had been placed. Then, the hardest part, I sealed the letter and walked the 2 miles to the next village to post it, so my father wouldn't see it when our own postman came. Every step felt like a betrayal of him, but a step closer to honoring my mother. While I waited for a reply, I began to gather what little I had. I had a small savings box where I kept money earned from selling eggs at the market. I counted it out on my bed one night, the coins and worn notes looking pitifully small under the lamplight. $17. It was everything I had in the world. It would have to be enough to get me to the city and find a place to stay while I sorted things out. I packed a small bag, the same one my mother had taken, just a few dresses, a cardigan, the photograph of my mother and Eleanor, and the birth certificate. It felt impossibly light for a journey that carried so much weight. The reply from the solicitor came a week later. I had been watching the post like a hawk, rushing out every morning before my father woke to check the box at the end of the lane. My heart hammered in my chest as I tore open the envelope. It contained the information I needed: the St. Jude's Home for Children, on a street I'd never heard of, in a city I'd only ever imagined. The letter also contained a stern warning about the responsibilities I was undertaking. It was a cold, legal document, but to me it was a map, a lifeline to Lily. The hardest part was writing the letter to my father. I must have written and rewritten it a dozen times, my tears blotting the ink. How could I explain that my leaving was an act of love, not of abandonment? How could I make him understand that I was choosing my mother's legacy over his grief? In the end, I kept it simple. Dearest Father, please do not be angry. I have gone to the city to find Eleanor's daughter. It is what Mother would have wanted. It is what I have to do. I cannot explain it in a way that will not cause you more pain, but I must honor her last act of love. This is not me leaving you. This is me trying to become the woman Mother believed I could be. I will write to you as soon as I can. Please, try to forgive me. Your loving daughter, Evelyn. I left the note on his pillow, where he would find it when he went to bed. The night I chose to leave was moonless and cold. A bitter wind rattled the window panes as if the world itself was trying to warn me against this foolish plan. I put on my heaviest coat, my small bag in one hand. I took one last look around the little cottage, at the familiar chairs, the ticking clock, the scent of wood smoke and sorrow. It was the only home I had ever known. Leaving it felt like tearing off a piece of my own skin. As my hand rested on the doorknob, I paused. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I saw a scared girl, barely a woman, about to step into a world she was completely unprepared for. My resolve wavered. My father's face flashed in my mind, the pain in his eyes. Maybe he was right. Maybe this was a mistake. My hand began to tremble. Then, my fingers brushed against the locket at my neck. I gripped it tightly, the metal cold and solid in my palm. Remember your strength. My mother's voice, a whisper in my memory. The courage to face fear. This was it. This was the moment. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I opened the door and slipped out into the darkness, closing it softly behind me. I walked the 4 miles to the train station in the nearest town, the strap of my bag digging into my shoulder. The world was asleep, and my footsteps on the empty road sounded unnervingly loud. The station was a small, desolate place, lit by a single, buzzing gas lamp that cast long, dancing shadows. I bought a one-way ticket to the city. The ticket agent, a weary-looking man, barely glanced at me. The ticket cost almost all the money I had. I was left with just a few dollars. As I stood on the platform, waiting for the train, the wind howled around me. whipping my hair across my face. The loneliness was a crushing physical presence. I had never felt so utterly and completely alone. For a terrifying moment, I considered turning back, running home to the familiar misery of the cottage, to my father. It would be so easy to undo it all. I could be in my own bed before sunrise. My father would never have to know. The shame of my brief rebellion would be my own secret to keep. The whistle of the approaching train screamed in the distance, a sound that felt like a final warning. It was the moment of decision my mother had foreseen all those years ago. The choice that would save me or destroy me. I closed my eyes, my hand wrapped so tightly around the locket that its edges dug into my palm. I thought of the photograph of the two smiling sisters. I thought of a 5-year-old girl in a strange building, waiting for a family that wasn't coming. When the train finally screeched into the station, its steam billowing like a great white beast, I took a deep breath, opened my eyes, and stepped aboard. The city was an assault on the senses. The moment I stepped off the train, I was hit by a wall of noise, the roar of traffic, the shouting of vendors, the endless sea of hurried footsteps on concrete. It smelled of exhaust fumes, hot pretzels, and a general, underlying dampness. It was nothing like the magazines. It was overwhelming, frightening, and utterly indifferent to the scared girl from the country with a few dollars in her pocket. For a moment, I just stood there, clutching my bag, wanting nothing more than to turn around and get back on the first train home. But home wasn't there anymore. Not in the same way. I had chosen this path. I spent my first night in a women's hostel, a grim, cheerless place that cost more than I could afford. The next morning, I knew I had to act fast. My money wouldn't last more than a day or two. My first priority was to find work, any work, that would allow me to find a small room to rent before I even thought about going to the orphanage. I couldn't very well present myself as a suitable guardian when I was homeless myself. I spent the day walking, my feet aching, going from shop to shop, cafe to cafe, asking if they needed help. I was met with a string of rejections. I was too young, I had no experience, I had no references. By late afternoon, hope had begun to dwindle, replaced by a gnawing panic. The city felt like a vast, stone monster that was slowly swallowing me whole. Finally, I stumbled into a small, family-run bakery. It was warm inside and smelled heavenly, of yeast and sugar and coffee. An elderly woman with flour on her apron and kind eyes looked up from kneading a mountain of dough. Her name was Mrs. Gable. I gave her my well-rehearsed speech, expecting the same polite dismissal. But she just watched me, her gaze thoughtful. "You look like you're running from something, child," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. Tears pricked my eyes. I don't know why, but her kindness just broke through my carefully constructed composure. I told her everything, the whole sad, tangled story about my mother, my father, Eleanor, and the little girl I had come to find. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She wiped her floury hands on her apron and then patted my arm. "Courage is a heavy thing to carry on your own," she said softly. "I have a small room upstairs. It's not much, but it's clean and warm. You can work here, in the bakery, to pay for your keep, and we will help you get your cousin." It was an act of such unexpected, profound kindness that I burst into tears. For the first time since leaving home, I felt a glimmer of hope. Mrs. Gable and her husband, a quiet, gentle man, took me in. They gave me a tiny attic room, a job, and something I needed even more, a safe harbor. I worked hard, learning to knead dough before dawn, serving customers, scrubbing floors until my back ached. But it was honest work, and with every loaf of bread I sold, I felt like I was earning my right to be there, building a foundation for the new life I needed to create for myself and for Lily. After a few weeks, once I had saved a tiny amount of money and felt more settled, I knew it was time. With my heart pounding, I made my way to St. Jude's Home for Children. It was a large, imposing brick building with tall, barred windows. It looked more like a prison than a home. I clutched the solicitor's letter in my hand like a shield. Inside, it smelled of disinfectant and boiled cabbage. A stern-looking matron with her hair in a tight bun looked me up and down with suspicion. "You're the cousin?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You look hardly more than a child yourself." I stood my ground, my voice shaking only slightly as I explained the situation. I presented the birth certificate and the letter. Reluctantly, she led me to a large, noisy playroom filled with children. And then I saw her. She was sitting in a corner, away from the other children, not playing with any of the toys. She was small for her age, with dark, wavy hair and large, solemn eyes that seemed to hold all the sorrow in the world. She was just sitting there, watching everyone with a quiet stillness that was heartbreaking in one so young. She looked nothing like the bubbly, smiling girls in the photograph. She just looked lost. "That's Lily," the matron said, not unkindly. "She doesn't speak, hasn't said a word since she arrived." My heart broke. The trauma of losing her mother, and then being taken from her home to this strange, loud place, had silenced her. I walked over slowly, so as not to frighten her. I knelt down so I was at her level. "Hello, Lily," I said softly. "My name is Evelyn. I was your mother's cousin." She just stared at me, her gaze empty, unresponsive. There was no recognition, no flicker of anything. I felt a surge of despair. How could I reach this child who had locked herself away so completely? I sat with her for a while, just talking quietly, telling her about the cottage and the lavender in the garden, about my mother. She didn't react. Finally, remembering the photograph, I pulled it from my pocket. It was the one of my mother and Eleanor as young girls, their arms around each other, grinning at the camera. I held it out to her. "Look, Lily," I said. "This is your mama, and this is my mama. They were sisters." For the first time, something changed in her expression. Her eyes focused on the photograph. She looked from the smiling face of the girl who was her mother to my face, and then back again. A tiny furrow appeared between her brows. Her small hand reached out, her fingers hesitantly touching the image. She traced the outline of her mother's face. Then she looked at me, truly looked at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of connection in her quiet, guarded eyes. It wasn't a solution. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was a beginning. It was a tiny crack in the wall of silence she had built around herself. I knew then that this journey was going to be longer and harder than I could ever have imagined. Bringing her home was one thing, but healing her, finding the little girl lost inside the silence, that would be the real test. And as I looked at her small, sad face, I made another promise, a silent one this time. I would not fail her. I would not fail my mother again. I would find a way to bring her back into the light. Bringing Lily home to my tiny attic room above the bakery was the beginning of the hardest journey of my life. The legal process was surprisingly straightforward, thanks to the solicitor's letters and Mrs. Gable acting as a character witness for me. But the real challenge wasn't in the paperwork. It was in the profound, echoing silence that Lily brought with her. She was a ghost in my small room, a constant, quiet presence who moved without making a sound and watched the world with those same haunted, vacant eyes. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't cry. She would eat what I put in front of her without complaint, and sleep without seeming to rest. My attempts at conversation were met with a wall of indifference. I read her stories. I tried to teach her simple games. I talked about our mothers, showing her the photograph of the two smiling sisters again and again. Nothing seemed to reach her. Days turned into weeks, and a desperate fear began to grow in my heart. What if I couldn't fix this? What if she was broken beyond repair? I felt so terribly ill-equipped. I was only 19, trying to be a mother to a child locked in a prison of trauma that I couldn't understand. The guilt I felt was immense. This was the result of our family's silence, of our abandonment. This was the price a child was paying for the mistakes of adults. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, overwhelmed by the responsibility, terrified that I had made a terrible mistake in bringing her here, that she would be better off with professionals. But then, I would look at her sleeping, her small face so peaceful in the moonlight, and I would touch the locket around my neck. Remember your strength. I couldn't give up on her. I was all she had. I wrote to my father every week, long letters telling him about my life at the bakery, about the Gables' kindness, and, cautiously, about Lily. I told him how quiet she was, how sad. I didn't blame him or accuse him. I just shared my struggle, hoping to build a bridge across the chasm between us. He never wrote back. The silence from him was another weight on my heart. But I kept writing, hoping one day he would listen. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. About 2 months after Lily had come to live with me, I was feeling particularly defeated. I had tried everything I could think of to connect with her, and nothing had worked. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, absently fiddling with the locket around my neck. I don't know why I did it then. After all those years, but I decided to try to open it one more time. The clasp was stiff with age. I wedged my thumbnail into the tiny groove and pushed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint click, it sprang open. My breath caught in my throat. I had always assumed it would hold tiny portraits, perhaps, of my mother's parents. But it didn't. On one side, nestled in the worn velvet, was a tiny, exquisitely detailed painting of a single lavender sprig, the scent of our garden, the smell of my mother. On the other side was a miniature portrait of a baby. A beautiful, tiny baby wrapped in a white blanket. As I stared at it, I realized it wasn't me. My mother had given me the locket when I was 16. This baby was a newborn. And then I knew, with absolute certainty, it was Lily. My mother must have had this commissioned during that last, fateful trip to the city. Before she died, she had held this image of her niece, the child she was trying to save, close to her heart. The locket wasn't just a symbol of past courage. It was a vessel of her last, unfulfilled wish. It was a promise of future love, a connection between the sisters, between mother and child, between me and the little girl sitting silently on the floor. At that moment, Lily, who had been watching me, crawled closer. She pointed a small finger at the open locket in my hand. Her eyes were fixed on the tiny painting of the baby. I turned it so she could see it better. "That's you, Lily," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "My mama had this made. She loved you so, so much." Lily looked from the portrait to my face, and then back to the portrait. Her lower lip began to tremble. A single, perfect tear rolled down her cheek, the first I had ever seen her shed, and then, a small, choked sound came from her throat. It was just a noise at first, a broken, rusty little sound, but then it formed into a word, a single, whispered word. "Mama." It shattered my heart and put it back together all at once. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tight as the dam of her silence finally broke. She began to sob, great, wrenching sobs of a child who had held in her grief for far too long. And I cried with her, cried for our lost mothers, for the lost years, for the pain and the silence, and for this small, miraculous breakthrough. That single word was the beginning of her healing, and of mine. From that day on, Lily began to talk. Slowly, at first, in hesitant phrases, but the words came. She told me about her mother, about her sickness, about the scary men who came after she died. And I listened. I just listened. A few weeks later, a letter arrived with a familiar country postmark. It was from my father. My hands shook as I opened it. It was short, only a few lines, written in his rough, unsteady hand. "I have been a fool," he wrote. "A proud, stubborn fool. Your mother would be ashamed of me. She would be so proud of you. I am selling the farm. It is too full of ghosts. I want to come to the city. I want to meet my granddaughter." And so, he came. A stooped, older man, his face etched with regret, but with a new light in his eyes. The first time he saw Lily, he just stood there, his hat in his hands, tears streaming down his face. Lily, who was still wary of strangers, hid behind my legs. But then he knelt down, just as I had, and he spoke her name, his voice thick with the grandfather's love. And our broken, fractured family began, piece by piece, to mend. The camera returns to the present day. The grandmother, Evelyn, holds the emerald locket in her open palm. A gentle smile plays on her lips, her eyes shining with unshed tears. We built a new life, the three of us, my father, Lily, and me. It wasn't always easy. There were scars, of course, but we filled the cracks with love and patience and so much talking. We talked about my mother and Eleanor, not as saints or villains, but as the complicated, loving, flawed women they were. Lily grew into a remarkable woman, full of laughter and life. The silence never claimed her again, and my father, in the end, found his peace. This little locket, you see, it taught me the most important lesson of my life. It taught me that courage isn't about the absence of fear. Oh dear, not at all. I was terrified every single step of the way. Courage is about acting in spite of your fear. It's about choosing love when the world gives you every reason to choose anger. It's about breaking a silence, even if your voice shakes. The heaviest burdens in life aren't the sorrows we carry, but the forgiveness we withhold. We all have a choice, every day, to stay barricaded behind our own pain, or to step out into the light and try to mend what's broken. It's the hardest work there is, but it's the only work that truly matters. And it all starts with a promise. A promise to be brave enough to open your heart.